I am 67 years old, and for the past 43 years, I have kept a secret that began with my grandfather and ended with his funeral in the winter of 1981. What happened at that funeral changed everything I thought I understood about life and death, about loyalty and love, about the boundaries between the human world and something far older and stranger that exists alongside it. My grandfather fed a creature in the woods behind his property every winter for nearly 3 decades. He never told a soul except me. He never asked for recognition or thanks. He simply did it year after year because he believed it was the right thing to do. And when he died, that creature came to pay its respects in a way that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. More than 200 people attended my grandfather's funeral that February morning. They came from all over the county, some from neighboring states, because Harold Whitmore was that kind of man, beloved, respected, the sort of person whose absence leaves a hole in the community that never quite fills. But none of those 200 people saw what I saw. None of them understood why the trees at the edge of the cemetery moved the way they did, or why the sound that rose from the forest as they lowered his casket made every bird within a mile take flight. I saw it. I understood it. And I have carried that knowledge alone for over 4 decades, waiting for the right time to share it, waiting until I was old enough that it would not matter if people thought I was crazy. That time has come. My name is Benjamin Whitmore, and this is the story of my grandfather, the creature he called brother, and the funeral that proved some bonds transcend everything we think we know about the nature of existence. Before I go any further, I need to ask you something. My granddaughter set this whole thing up for me. The camera and the microphone and whatever platform this ends up on. She says I need to ask people to like and subscribe, that it helps with something called visibility. I do not fully understand how any of this works. In my day, if you wanted to tell a story, you gathered people around a fire and you told it. But apparently, the modern version involves buttons and algorithms and other things that sound like science fiction to a man who still uses a rotary phone. So if you would, press whatever buttons help this story reach more people. Not for me. I am too old to care about fame or fortune. But for my grandfather, whose story deserves to be heard, and for the creature in the woods, who deserves to be remembered as something other than a monster. Now, let me tell you about Harold Whitmore. My grandfather was born in 1901 in a small town in the mountains of Western Virginia, the kind of place that does not exist anymore except in photographs and the memories of people like me who are old enough to remember when the world was different. He grew up hard, the way everyone did back then. Lost his mother to influenza when he was 7. Lost his father to a mining accident when he was 12. Raised himself and his 2 younger sisters on a farm that barely produced enough to keep them fed. He fought in the Second World War, came back with medals he never talked about, and nightmares he never escaped. He married my grandmother in 1946. Built a house on 200 acres of forested land that had been in the family for generations and settled into a life of quiet purpose. He raised cattle, he grew vegetables, he helped his neighbors when they needed it and asked for nothing in return. He was the kind of man they do not make anymore, solid and dependable and deeply, fundamentally good. I spent every summer of my childhood on that farm, from the time I was 5 until I left for college at 18. Those summers shaped me in ways I am still discovering. My grandfather taught me how to track deer through the forest, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to fix a fence and birth a calf, and 100 other skills that seemed useless when I moved to the city, but that I have come to treasure as I have grown older. He taught me patience and persistence and the value of hard work. But more than any of that, he taught me that the world was bigger and stranger than most people wanted to admit. He never said it directly, not until much later. But I could see it in the way he looked at the forest that bordered his property, the way his eyes would track movement in the shadows that I could never quite make out, the way he would pause sometimes in the middle of a task and listen to something I could not hear. There was a reverence in him when he faced those woods, a respect that went beyond the normal caution a farmer has for wild places. It was the summer of 1968 when I finally learned the truth. I was 14 years old, gangly and awkward, and convinced that I knew everything about everything. My grandfather and I had been working all day, repairing a section of fence on the far eastern edge of his property, the part that ran closest to the deep forest. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, and we were packing up our tools when my grandfather suddenly went still. "Listen," he said. I listened. At first I heard nothing unusual. The chirp of crickets, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through leaves. But then, underneath all of that, I heard something else, a sound that made my skin prickle and my heart accelerate for reasons I could not explain. It was like a voice, but not quite. Too deep, too resonant, almost like someone humming a single note that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What is that?" I asked. My grandfather did not answer immediately. He was looking toward the forest, toward a gap in the trees about 100 yards away, where the shadows seemed thicker than they should have been. His expression was not fearful. It was something else. Anticipation, maybe, or recognition. "That," he said finally, "is something I need to show you. Something I should have shown you a long time ago. But you were not ready before. I think you might be ready now." He started walking toward the forest, and after a moment of hesitation, I followed. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to go back to the farmhouse, to the warm kitchen where my grandmother was probably starting dinner, to the safe and normal world I understood. But curiosity won out, as it usually did with me. My grandfather had never steered me wrong before. If he said I needed to see something, then I needed to see it. We walked into the trees, following a path I had never noticed before, despite years of exploring these woods. The light faded quickly under the canopy, but my grandfather moved with the confidence of someone who had made this journey many times. The sound grew louder as we walked, that strange humming that seemed to vibrate in my chest rather than my ears. Then my grandfather stopped, and I almost ran into his back. We had reached a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, ringed by ancient oaks, whose branches interlocked overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral. The last light of sunset filtered through the leaves, casting everything in a golden glow. And in the center of the clearing, sitting on a fallen log as if it had been waiting for us, was something that should not have existed. I want to describe it to you properly, but I'm not sure I have the words, even after all these years. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, even in its seated position. Its body was covered in dark fur, almost black in the fading light, but with patches of gray around the muzzle and chest that suggested age. Its frame was humanoid, 2 arms and 2 legs, and a torso that was proportioned roughly like a man's, but scaled up to enormous size. The muscles beneath the fur were clearly visible, powerful, and defined in a way that spoke of strength beyond anything human. But the face was what held me frozen in place, unable to run even if I had wanted to. It was not human. The snout was elongated, filled with teeth that gleamed when it opened its mouth slightly. The ears were pointed, rising above the top of its skull like a wolf's. But the eyes were something else entirely, dark and deep and filled with an intelligence that was unmistakable. Those eyes were watching me with curiosity and caution, and something that might have been hope. I could not move, could not breathe. My 14-year-old brain was trying desperately to categorize what I was seeing, to fit it into some framework I could understand. A bear standing upright? No, the proportions were wrong. A man in a costume? Impossible. The movement was too fluid, too natural. What I was seeing was exactly what it appeared to be, something that existed outside of every category I had been taught. My grandfather put his hand on my shoulder, and the touch broke through my paralysis. "Easy," he said quietly. "He will not hurt you. He is a friend." Then my grandfather did something that astonished me more than the creature itself. He walked forward, crossing the clearing with calm, unhurried steps, and stopped directly in front of the massive being. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, I saw it was a large piece of dried meat, jerky of some kind. He held it out, and the creature reached forward with one enormous hand and took it gently, so gently that not a single finger brushed my grandfather's palm. "Hello, brother," my grandfather said. "I brought someone to meet you. This is my grandson, Benjamin." The creature's eyes shifted from my grandfather to me. It studied me for a long moment, that intelligent gaze taking in every detail of my frozen, terrified posture. Then it did something I will never forget. It nodded. A single, deliberate nod, exactly the way a human would nod in greeting. And it made a sound, a low rumble deep in its chest, that somehow conveyed welcome. That was my introduction to the being my grandfather called brother. Over the following summers, I learned the story of how they had met, a story I will share with you now. But first, I want to ask you something. Have you ever encountered something you could not explain? Have you ever stood at the edge of the known world and glimpsed something beyond it? If you have, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Because for a long time, I thought my grandfather and I were the only people who had ever experienced something like this. But as I have grown older, I have come to believe that there are more of us than we realize. People who have seen things that do not fit into the tidy categories of normal existence. We just do not talk about it because we are afraid of being thought crazy. Well, I am 67 years old, and I am done being afraid. Share your story if you have one. You might be surprised how many people understand. Now, back to my grandfather and brother. The winter of 1952 was one of the worst in living memory for that part of Virginia. Snow began falling in early November and did not stop until March. Temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for weeks at a time. Cattle froze in the fields. Pipes burst. People died, especially the old and the young, and those who did not have enough food or fuel to outlast the endless cold. My grandfather was better prepared than most. He had laid in supplies, stocked his barn with hay, made sure the house was tight against the wind. But even so, it was a hard winter. He spent most of his days just trying to keep the farm running, feeding animals that were burning through their reserves, trying to stay warm, breaking ice on the troughs so they could drink, hauling wood to keep the fire burning. One night in late January, with the temperature at 15 below and the wind howling like something alive, my grandfather heard a sound outside his barn. Not the wind, not an animal he recognized. Something else. A cry that was almost human, but not quite. A sound of pain so profound it cut through the storm and lodged in his chest like a splinter. He should have stayed inside. He knew that. Going out in weather like that was dangerous, potentially deadly. But Harold Whitmore was not the kind of man who could ignore suffering, even when helping meant risking himself. He bundled up in every piece of clothing he owned, grabbed a lantern and his rifle, and went out into the storm. What he found behind his barn changed his life forever. It was a creature like the one I would meet 16 years later, but younger and smaller, still massive by human standards, probably 6 feet tall and heavily muscled, but clearly not fully grown. And it was dying. The creature had been caught in something, a trap or a snare. My grandfather was never sure which. Its left leg was mangled, torn almost to the bone, and the blood that should have been pumping from such a wound had frozen into dark crystals against its fur. It was lying in the snow, shivering, its breath coming in shallow gasps that produced small clouds of vapor that were immediately whipped away by the wind. My grandfather stood there for a long moment, looking at this impossible thing, trying to understand what he was seeing. His rifle was in his hands, and later he would tell me that he considered using it. Not out of fear, though he was afraid, but out of mercy. The creature was suffering, and ending that suffering seemed like the kindest thing he could do. But then the creature opened its eyes, and my grandfather saw something that stopped him cold. Intelligence, awareness, and underneath those things, a desperate, wordless plea. Help me, please help me. My grandfather made his decision in that moment the same way I imagine he made decisions on battlefields in Europe a decade earlier, quickly and completely, with no second guessing. He set down his rifle, approached the creature slowly with his hands visible, and began to assess the damage to its leg. What followed was the longest night of my grandfather's life. He couldn't carry the creature, it was too heavy, but he could not leave it out in the storm either. So he did the only thing he could think of. He went back to the barn, gathered every blanket and tarp he could find, and built a makeshift shelter around the creature right where it lay. He wrapped its leg as best he could with strips torn from his own shirt, applying pressure to slow the bleeding that had resumed once the frozen blood began to thaw from his body heat. He stayed with it through the night, huddled under those tarps and blankets, sharing his warmth with something that every rational part of his mind said should not exist. The creature watched him the entire time. Those intelligent eyes tracked his every movement, studying him, assessing him. At some point during the night, as the storm raged and the cold tried to kill them both, the creature reached out with one massive hand and touched my grandfather's arm. Just touched it, gently, deliberately. A gesture of acknowledgement, of thanks, of connection. My grandfather would later tell me that in that moment, something passed between them that he could never adequately describe. An understanding, a recognition of kinship that went beyond species, beyond logic, beyond everything he had been taught about the world and his place in it. He had come out into the storm to save a suffering animal. He realized now that he had found something much more than that. He had found a friend. The creature survived the night. Over the following weeks, as the winter slowly released its grip, my grandfather nursed it back to health. He brought it food, mostly meat from his own stores. He changed its bandages. He sat with it in the shelter he had built, talking to it even though he had no idea if it understood, simply because the silence felt wrong. And gradually the creature began to heal. Its leg would never be quite right, my grandfather said. It walked with a slight limp for the rest of its life. But it lived, and when spring finally came and the snow began to melt, the creature did not leave. Not entirely. It would disappear into the forest for days or weeks at a time, but it always came back. Always returned to the edge of my grandfather's property, to the clearing in the woods where they had first truly seen each other. And my grandfather was always there to meet it, bringing food and company and the simple gift of presence. This continued for years, then decades. The creature grew larger and older, its muzzle going grey, its movements becoming more deliberate. My grandfather aged too, his hair turning white, his steps slowing. But their bond never weakened. If anything, it deepened. They developed a way of communicating that my grandfather struggled to explain. Not language exactly. The creature never spoke in words, but gestures, expressions, sounds that carried meaning. My grandfather learned to read the creature's moods, to understand when it was content or worried or amused, and the creature learned to read him in return. By the time I met Brother in 1968, they had known each other for 16 years, and my grandfather had kept the secret for all that time. He never told my grandmother, never told his children, never told anyone except me, and only then because he said he could see something in me that reminded him of himself, a capacity for wonder, a willingness to accept things that did not fit into neat categories, a heart big enough to make room for the impossible. I spent the remaining summers of my childhood and adolescence visiting Brother in that clearing. I brought food too, learning what the creature liked and did not like. Venison was its favorite, followed by fish. It would eat vegetables if nothing else was available, but without enthusiasm. It had preferences and quirks, and a personality that became more apparent the more time I spent with it. It liked when I talked to it, even though it could not respond with words. It would sit and listen, head tilted slightly, those dark eyes fixed on my face. Sometimes it would make sounds in response, rumbles and huffs that seemed to carry emotional weight even if they lacked linguistic meaning. It was playful sometimes, especially in the early years when we were both younger. It would hide and leap out to startle me, then make that chuffing sound that I learned meant laughter. It had a sense of humor. Can you imagine that? A creature from nightmare and legend, something that by all rights should not exist, making jokes and enjoying the reactions. But it could be serious too. Sometimes it would look at me with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable, as if it was trying to communicate something important that it lacked the tools to express. Those moments always felt significant, weighted with meaning I could not quite grasp. And it was protective, fiercely protective. I learned that the hard way once, when a black bear wandered too close to the clearing while Brother and I were there. The sound Brother made, the way it positioned itself between me and the potential threat, made it absolutely clear that it considered me part of its circle, something to be defended at any cost. The bear fled. I would have too if I had been able to move. My grandfather noticed the same protectiveness directed toward him. Brother would patrol the edges of his property in winter, leaving tracks in the snow that my grandfather learned to recognize. It would leave offerings sometimes, a deer carcass placed near the barn, rabbits hung from low branches, gifts of food to supplement what my grandfather provided. They were taking care of each other, these two beings from different worlds, in the only ways they knew how. I asked my grandfather once why he had never told anyone else about brother. We were sitting on his porch, watching the sunset over the mountains, and the question had been building in me for years. He was quiet for a long time before answering. "Because the world is not ready," he said finally. "People fear what they do not understand. If others knew brother existed, they would hunt him, capture him, kill him probably, out of fear or curiosity or simple cruelty. I cannot let that happen. He saved my life that winter night, even though I was the one who thought I was saving him. His company has gotten me through years of loneliness and loss. He is my friend, Benjamin, the best friend I have ever had in some ways. And you do not betray your friends." I understood what he meant. I still do. But carrying that secret has been a weight I have borne for over 50 years now. And I'm tired. I am old. I do not have many years left, and when I die, this story dies with me, unless I share it. So I'm sharing it, not because the world is any more ready now than it was then, but because some truths deserve to be told, even if they are not believed, even if they change nothing, simply because they are true. My grandfather died in February of 1981. He was 80 years old, which was a good run for a man who had lived as hard as he had. His heart gave out in his sleep, peacefully, which was more than many people get. My grandmother had passed 3 years earlier, and in those final years, my grandfather had lived alone on the farm, refusing all offers to move in with family, insisting he was fine where he was. I think I know now why he refused to leave. He could not abandon brother, could not break the routine they had maintained for nearly 30 years. Even at the end, even when his body was failing, he made his weekly trips to that clearing with food and company. I found his journal after he died, and the entries from those final months are heartbreaking. His handwriting deteriorated as his strength faded, but he never missed a visit. Not once. The funeral was held on a Saturday, a cold, clear day with snow on the ground and a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. The whole town turned out, as I said. My grandfather was a pillar of that community, and his loss was felt by everyone who knew him. The service was held in the small church where he and my grandmother had been married 50 years earlier. People spoke about his kindness, his generosity, his unshakable integrity. They told stories I had never heard, about things he had done for people that he had never mentioned to anyone. He was a good man, the best I have ever known. After the service, the procession made its way to the cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. It was a beautiful location, surrounded by forest on 3 sides, with a view of the mountains my grandfather had loved. The grave had been dug that morning, a dark rectangle in the white snow, waiting to receive him. The minister said some final words as the casket was lowered. People wept. I stood with my family, my arm around my mother, who was shaking with grief, trying to be strong, even as my own heart was breaking. And then I noticed the birds. They had been singing when we arrived at the cemetery, the normal chatter of winter birds going about their business. But suddenly they stopped. All of them. At once. The silence was so abrupt and so complete that several people looked up, confused by the absence of sound they had not consciously noticed until it was gone. I looked toward the tree line at the edge of the cemetery. The trees there were old-growth forest, the same forest that bordered my grandfather's property, that contained the clearing where brother waited. and in the shadows between those trees, I saw movement. Not clearly, not enough to make out details, just shapes, darker shadows among the shadows, watching, waiting. Then the sound came. It started low, so low I felt it more than heard it. A vibration in my chest, in my bones, in the frozen ground beneath my feet. It rose slowly, building in volume and intensity, until it became a sound like nothing I have ever heard before or since. It was a howl. But that word does not do it justice. It was grief given voice, loss transformed into sound, a cry of mourning so profound, so deeply felt, that it seemed to shake the very air. It came from the tree line, from that place where the shadows moved. And it was immediately answered by other voices, other howls, rising from different points around the cemetery's edge. Not one creature. Many. How many I could not say. The sounds overlapped and merged until it was impossible to count individual voices. They were mourning him. Brother was mourning my grandfather, and others of its kind had come to join in that mourning. The howling lasted maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. People were frozen in place, faces pale with shock and fear, unable to process what they were hearing. Some of the older farmers probably recognized it for what it was, had heard similar sounds in their youth before they dismissed such things as superstition and imagination. But most of them had never experienced anything like it. When the howling stopped, the silence that followed was even more profound than before. No bird called, no wind stirred. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath. Then, from the tree line directly in front of me, a single figure emerged. It was Brother. I recognized him immediately, even at that distance. The gray in his fur, the slight limp in his gait, the massive frame that moved with such surprising grace. He walked to the edge of the tree line and stopped, visible now to everyone in the cemetery, too far away for details, but close enough that there was no denying what he was. Not a man, not a bear, something else. He looked at the grave where my grandfather's casket had come to rest, and then he did something that still brings tears to my eyes when I remember it. He knelt. This enormous creature, this being of legend and nightmare, knelt in the snow at the edge of the forest. He bowed his head, and he stayed that way for a long moment, paying his respects to the man who had saved his life nearly 30 years before, the man who had kept his secret and earned his trust and been his friend across all those years. Then he rose. He looked directly at me across the distance that separated us, and even though I could not see his eyes clearly, I felt them. I felt the grief in them, the loss, but also something else, recognition, acknowledgement, a passing of responsibility from one generation to the next. He turned and walked back into the forest, and the shadows swallowed him. The other shapes that had gathered at the tree line faded as well, melting into the darkness as if they had never been there. The birds began to sing again. The world resumed its normal rhythm. But nothing was normal. Nothing would ever be normal again for anyone who had witnessed what just happened. There was chaos after that, as you might imagine. People shouting and crying and demanding explanations. Some wanted to go into the forest to find the creature. Others wanted to run to get as far from this place as possible. The minister was praying loudly, his voice shaking. My mother was asking me what was happening, gripping my arm so hard it left bruises. I did the only thing I could think of. I lied. I told everyone it must have been a bear, that bears sometimes made sounds like that the stress and emotion of the funeral had made it seem stranger than it was. I said anything I could think of to calm them down, to redirect their attention, to protect brother, the way my grandfather had protected him for all those years. Most people accepted my explanations, or at least pretended to. They wanted to believe there was a rational explanation because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate. Within a few weeks, the story had become just another piece of local folklore, a strange thing that happened at Harold Whitmore's funeral that got more exaggerated with each retelling. But I knew the truth, and I knew that something had changed. After the funeral, after everyone had gone home and the excitement had died down, I went back to the cemetery alone. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow, and the air was cold enough to burn my lungs with each breath. I walked to my grandfather's grave, still fresh, the earth mounded over the casket, not yet covered with the stone that would eventually mark it. I stood there for a long time, saying goodbye in my own way. Then I walked to the tree line where brother had appeared. There were tracks in the snow, massive tracks, too large to be any known animal. I followed them into the forest, using the skills my grandfather had taught me all those years ago. They led to the clearing. Brother was there, sitting on the same fallen log where I had first seen him 15 years earlier. He looked old. I had not noticed it as much during the funeral, when shock and distance had blurred the details. But now, up close, I could see the gray that had spread through his fur, the stiffness in his joints, the weariness in those dark, intelligent eyes. He was aging, the same way my grandfather had aged, the same way I was aging. We looked at each other for a long moment, two beings bound by a shared loss, a shared history, a shared secret. Then I did what my grandfather had always done. I reached into my coat and pulled out the food I had brought, knowing somehow that this moment would come. Brother took it gently, the way he always did. He ate slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. When he finished, he made a sound. That low rumble that I had learned meant many things depending on context. This time, it meant thank you and goodbye, and I will miss him. I will miss him too, I said. So much, brother nodded. That simple human gesture that still had the power to astonish me, no matter how many times I saw it. Then he reached out and touched my arm, the same way my grandfather had described being touched that first night in the blizzard so many years ago. A gesture of connection, of acknowledgement, of passing something important from one holder to another. I understood what he was asking. He wanted me to continue what my grandfather had started, to bring food in the winters, to keep the secret, to maintain the bond that had sustained them both for nearly 30 years. I nodded back. I will, I said, for as long as I am able, I promise. Brother held my gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked into the darkening forest. I watched him go, this creature that should not exist, this being that had somehow become family. And I kept my promise. For the next 23 years, until brother himself passed away in the winter of 2004, I maintained the tradition my grandfather had begun. Every winter, when the snow lay deep and the cold bit hard, I made my way to that clearing with food and company. Sometimes brother was there waiting. Sometimes I had to wait for him. But he always came, and we always had our time together, two friends meeting in the space between worlds. He aged as I aged. His fur went from gray to white. His movements became slower, more deliberate. The limp from his old injury grew more pronounced, but his eyes never changed. That intelligence, that awareness, that capacity for connection remained as strong as ever, right up until the end. I found him in the clearing one February morning, lying still in the snow where he had always sat. At first, I thought he was sleeping, but when I approached and saw the peacefulness in his face, the utter stillness of his chest, I knew he was gone. He had come to our place, to the clearing where he and my grandfather had first truly seen each other over 50 years before, and he had laid down and let go. I sat with him for a long time that morning, crying the way I had cried when my grandfather died, grieving a loss that I could never fully explain to anyone else. He had been part of my life for 36 years, part of my grandfather's life for even longer. He was family in every way that mattered. I buried him there in the clearing. It took me 3 days to dig a grave deep enough in the frozen ground, but I did it. I could not bear the thought of leaving him for scavengers, of his body being found and studied and dissected by people who would never understand what he was. He deserved better than that. He deserved to rest in peace, in the place that had been his home for as long as I could remember. I go back to that clearing sometimes, even now. The grave has long since been covered by fallen leaves and growing moss, invisible to anyone who does not know where to look. But I know. I sit on the log where brother used to sit, and I talk to them both. My grandfather, brother, the two friends who taught me that the world is bigger and stranger and more wonderful than most people will ever know. I am 67 years old. I do not know how many years I have left, but however many it is, I will carry their memory with me. The story of a man who walked into a blizzard to help a suffering creature, the creature who came to his funeral to mourn him, the bond that transcended species and logic and everything we think we understand about the nature of existence. I told you at the beginning that I was sharing this story because some truths deserve to be told. That is true. But there is another reason, one I have not mentioned until now. In the years since brother died, I have seen signs that others of his kind still exist in these mountains. Tracks in the snow, shapes moving in the darkness, sounds in the night that make my heart race with memories of all those years in the clearing. They are out there, brother's people, his family, and they know about me. I have found offerings on my porch in winter, deer meat, rabbit, fish, gifts left in the night by creatures I never see, but whose presence I can feel. They are continuing the tradition that my grandfather began, the exchange of care and respect that defined his relationship with brother. I am part of their world now, the same way my grandfather was, the same way brother was part of ours. Sometimes I wonder what will happen when I am gone. I have no children, no one to pass this responsibility to the way my grandfather passed it to me. The thought of that connection being broken, of those creatures being left alone after all these years, weighs on me in ways I cannot fully express. But perhaps that is why I am telling this story now. Perhaps someone watching will understand, will recognize something in what I am describing, will feel called to continue what Harold Whitmore started in that blizzard 70 years ago. If you are that person, if something in this story resonates with you in a way you cannot explain, I want you to know that the clearing is still there. The forest still stands, despite development and logging, that has taken so much of the wild places. And they are still there, watching, waiting, hoping perhaps that someone else will come. Someone else will see them not as monsters to be feared, but as neighbors to be respected, as friends to be cherished, as family to be protected. My grandfather understood that. brother understood it too. And now maybe you understand it as well. That is all I have to say. Thank you for listening to an old man's impossible story. Thank you for taking the time to hear about my grandfather and the creature he called brother and the bond that shaped both their lives. I do not know if anyone will believe me. I do not know if it matters whether they do. What matters is that the story has been told, that their memory lives on, out in the world, adding its small voice to the chorus of testimony from people who have seen what I have seen. People who know that the darkness holds more than shadows, that the forest holds more than trees, that this world we think we understand is only a small part of something much larger, much older, much more mysterious than our limited minds can comprehend. My grandfather knew that. He lived it every day for nearly 30 years, and when he died, the forest itself came to mourn him, to honor him, to say goodbye to a man who had earned its respect and its love. That is his legacy. That is the truth I have carried for 43 years. And that is what I want you to remember long after you have forgotten my name and my face and the details of this story. Remember that kindness matters. Remember that compassion transcends boundaries. Remember that sometimes, if you are very lucky and very brave, the impossible becomes possible, and the world opens up to show you wonders you never imagined. Harold Whitmore was my grandfather. He fed a creature in the woods for nearly 3 decades, and his funeral was unlike anything that town had ever seen. Now you know why. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. But I hope, whatever else you do, that you walk gently in the wild places, that you look at the shadows between the trees with wonder instead of fear, that you remember there are things out there that watch us with intelligent eyes and ancient wisdom, waiting to see if we are worthy of their trust. My grandfather was worthy. I have tried to be worthy too. Perhaps someday, if you are brave enough and kind enough and open enough to the mysteries of this strange and beautiful world, you will have the chance to prove yourself worthy as well. Until then, remember them. Remember Harold Whitmore. Remember brother. Remember that the bond between them was real, and that it lasted beyond death, and that it changed everyone who was lucky enough to witness it. That is all I ask. Remember them. They deserve at least that much.